need to introduce the speaker for today. Who is going to be speaking today? Today we have Anwar. He is joining us all the way from Malaysia. Now, what he does, he is popularly known as the entrepreneur doctor. He has co-authored a book. He writes articles about entrepreneurship, and today's session is specifically about it. You don't need to start a business to be entrepreneur. You can have your entrepreneurship skills developed even whatever things you are doing right now. I am very curious because entrepreneurship is always about you need to start the business, you have to find investors, you have to do that, you have to do that, you have to scale your business. But it's got something interesting to talk about. So get your curiosity mind out. I am excited to hear Anwar. I am pretty sure you all are. So over to you, Anwar, to take us through the session. Myself, Tulika, and Faisal will be there all throughout the session to help you out.
Welcome. I'm going to share a little deck. Let me see if I can get it up. So good evening and hello from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. The days have been getting a little bit better since we seem to be having the COVID crisis under control. And I hope wherever you are today, that things are improving for you. And as we get back to a different type of working. So my topic is a little bit interesting, I think, and I hope that you will find it interesting. I'm happy to take questions. It's not a long presentation. And what I'd like you to do is really sit back and listen to some of the things to three stories essentially that I have. And in terms of my working career, I've essentially worked, my first part of the career, I worked as a naval architect, which is designing ships and rigs, and I worked in a shipyard. And then another part of my career, I worked for a venture capital company, and we were investing in startups and technology companies. And then another part of my career, I worked in a budget hotel group, and we have hotels, or when I worked for them, we had hotels across Asia, and one in India and UK and Australia. So essentially I've worked for three organizations for some length of time. And in between, I have been an entrepreneur 3 times and unfortunately not made any money while I was an entrepreneur. So they were what you call learning experiences. So today I'd like to share a little bit of a journey with you. And I have 3 stories from 3 parts of my life. And I'd like you to sit and take notes and see what the commonalities are and see what are the dots that you can connect. I will take maybe half an hour and then happy to take questions after that. So the first story is a story that we are all part of, which is the COVID crisis. Now, when COVID first hit, my wife was actually in Singapore, where we have one of our kids, and she had gone down to help with our grandchild. And so I was alone. And when COVID first hit, I like reading. And so I thought, let's pass the time by reading. And I generally don't read fiction, but there was no nonfiction left in the house. So I sort of looked through my wife's books and I picked up a whole stack. And I spent the first few weeks reading fiction, which I enjoyed, and waiting for COVID to end. Well, as we all know, it actually didn't end in a few weeks. And so once that realization set in, you sort of kick in and say, okay, it's not going to end. I can't keep reading and doing nothing much else. And so then you sort of kick in and go to action, right? So, my family, the kids are a little bit distributed in the sense, and, we had the fasting month during the COVID period. And so whilst everybody was in lockdown in different parts of the world, and my kids were in lockdown in Singapore, Bombay, UK, and San Francisco. So I have 4 children, and they live in different parts of the world, and everybody was experiencing lockdown at different times. And so we got used to a routine of calling people with video and trying to stay connected. And as I like to say, we were socially connected but physically distant. Now, for those of you in the IT business, this is not a new thing, right? You have distributed teams working everywhere. And when you have distributed teams, you don't say these are socially distant teams, right? These are distributed teams around the world and they are connected. And so we have to be grateful for technology that allowed us to stay in touch. And it was also a time that we reached out, and all of us did that, reached out to help where we could help, and also reached out to people that we hadn't seen for a while and just check in and say, how are you doing? Because it's the first time, I guess, the whole world was united in a simple prayer, which is, dear God, please deliver us from this and keep us safe. And so it was quite a unique experience as we went through this COVID period. And what we realized is a couple of things, right? So we realized that we could stay connected and we could communicate with each other. And the other thing that we realized is that distances actually disappeared and had no meaning. So for example, if you were used to doing business with somebody, you'd give them a call and have lunch or have coffee with them, or you'd attend a meeting of your society, or in my case, I'm a member of the speakers group in Singapore. And so you would be connected with people that you actually could have lunch with or breakfast with or coffee with. And those people who you could physically meet seem to have an advantage over the people that you could not physically meet. And what essentially COVID did was it removed that advantage. So it didn't matter that you were in the house next door or the street next door. You could no longer have coffee together. And therefore, distances actually became the same for everybody. So you were able to reach over and speak to somebody that you ordinarily would not be able to speak to because you would not be able to get them for a coffee. So I was not a very active member of my Speakers Association in Singapore because it was very difficult to coordinate a visit to Singapore at the same time that they had their event. But once COVID stepped in, I became an active member. And the amazing thing was, as you are seeing in your empowerment talks, that you become an active member regardless of where you are. So actually, COVID was a very interesting binding relationship building experience. And so COVID actually made us more socially connected. And that's why we should use the word that we are physically distant, but we are actually emotionally more connected. So I had actually more meetings that I attended with my speakers group. And in the breakout sessions using Zoom, it's amazing how much you can get to know somebody in just 3 or 5 minutes. And in 3 or 5 minutes, exchanging experiences about how we manage and how we cope in these COVID times was a very connecting experience. And there were loads and loads of conferences going on over the last few weeks, So I saw Arundhati Roy talk about emerging from the pandemic, a wonderful explanation of how we can build a new society. And this is an opportunity for us to come through and build a new society. I attended events in Australia, in United Kingdom, in the US, and it was a wonderful experience. And actually, rather than saying that borders were closed, I say that borders were actually open. So communities were able to join and get together and do things that ordinarily they would not be able to do, right? So COVID has been, and still is, a remarkable experience. We are united in a prayer. We are united in a desire for a better world. And we have been able to work together. And what has been absolutely inspiring is all the work that's being done by small communities to help people around them, to help your neighbors, to help people who are less fortunate. So it's actually been an amazing experience. And it's been a very positive experience. I mean, there have been some difficulties. So, you know, with my wife in Singapore during Eid, normally during Eid time, some of the kids come back and we have Eid lunch together. Well, you know, this time we had each Eid lunch in 4 different homes and had to connect on Zoom. And so we were sharing meals across Zoom as opposed to sharing meals physically. So there were some differences. And essentially what COVID has done is that it allowed you to connect. It removed borders. It allowed you to experiment with new technologies. And for a lot of businesses like mine, where we do speaking and coaching and workshops, we've converted the physical workshop to a virtual workshop. And interestingly enough, the virtual workshops have gone very well. So technology has been an amazing tool that we've been able to use. And I encourage for all of you that feel that it is a difficult time to think about the benefits as well. Think about what you have been able to do. Think about where you've been able to go. Think about the people that have shared things with you. And think about the opportunity to rebuild your business. And you are going to rebuild your business in a manner that's going to be far more powerful than it was before. And we all need to rebuild our business from time to time because, like it or not, presidents or prime ministers are not going to be able to shut borders to thinking, and they are not going to be able to shut borders to work that can be distributed. You can put tariffs on products that are physical, but on products that are not physical, they will walk through borders. And so the COVID time has been interesting. And I sort of summarize it with three statements, really. Technology connected physically distant people. Communities actually opened when borders were closed. And we learned how to do things differently, and we still got it done. So, you know, this is the first story, right? The first story is about COVID. How did you react? How did communities react? And what do you think is the underlying skill or the underlying thought process or the underlying mindset that allowed people to manage and do well? So COVID is the first story, and I'd like you to maybe in the chat jot down some points about what do you think what do you think was the underlying strength and the underlying drive that helped people get through this period. So that's story number one. Story number two is something that I've written about for some time, and that's the story of millennials. Now, millennials are people born from, I think, 81 to 96. And a lot of people have not used positive language when describing millennials. And a lot of people go around and use, and I talk to HR managers and recruiters, and they say that, you know, millennials are not committed to work. Millennials do too many different things. And they are worried about their ability to work with millennials. And what I've always said is that actually millennials are no different to people of my generation. Because if my generation had the same tools that millennials have today, we would behave the same way. The reason why people of my generation worked for long periods of time with companies was, people say, out of loyalty. And actually, I say it wasn't loyalty. It's because people of my generation didn't know what else there was. There was a lack of information, right? Why would you want to work for 5 days and get 5 days wage when you can work for 3 days and get 5 days wage, right? So many people got stuck in that loyalty is good and loyalty should be rewarded. Well, guys, hate to break it to you, but most companies did not reward loyalty. When things got tough, lots of people got let go. And so millennials get a bad rap, but actually they're behaving the same way that we would behave. And the thing about millennials is people say they're always on the phone, right? So there are, to me, no really difference between millennials and people like in my generation, but there are a few things that set them apart. And one is their access to information and technology. People in my generation subscribed to the newspapers, and that became our source of information, right? You subscribe to newspapers, you watch certain news, and you know at the end of the day, you've consumed the news, you've consumed the newspapers, and you feel satisfied, right? If you were at university or school, you would go and borrow a book. If the book was available, you'd take it home, you'd read it. And once you read it, you could pat yourself on the shoulder, say, I've done the job, right? And the interesting thing for millennials is the difficulty that they have to pat themselves. The reason why they're on the phone and the reason why they keep looking is because they cannot complete the task. If you are given a piece of research 20 years ago, there was a limit to what you could do. When you had exhausted the libraries, when you had exhausted the references, that was it. You pat yourself on the shoulder and say, good job, Anwar, good job. You've done the work. But if information is endless, when do you know you've done enough? The second problem comes, how do you know the bias of what somebody is posting? In the old days, you buy a newspaper, you know that this newspaper carries this particular voice. When you read it, you know they have a particular bias. When you read something off the internet, you don't know what the bias is. So millennials actually have a tough time. They have a tough time because they can never stop themselves and say, I know enough. It's time to stop. They can't stop because when they read something, they don't know the bias of the author. They don't know the bias of the publication. So they are no different to us, but their environment actually puts them at a great deal of stress. And they are also, I think, better than my generation in that they need a sense of belonging. And this sense of belonging and the need to make a difference means that they have passion. And they have passion in a community at a much wider and broader scale than probably people of my generation. And you can see that. I mean, I do some work with NGOs. And if I cast my net around and I look at who is out there helping communities, it's the millennials. The millennials are the guys who are out there helping communities. So millennials are no different to us. I think they have a tougher time. But I'm also thankful that they are there, and I'm thankful that they have a sense of purpose. And this sense of purpose is impacting the workplace. So sometimes I had a conversation not so long ago with a recruiting manager, and he was frustrated because he said, I'm offering this young person a position. It's going to lead them to a manager role, and they don't seem interested. And he's like, I don't understand why they're not interested. And I asked him a simple question. I said, why is it a good thing? And he said, well, it happened to me. I took that path and see where I am. And I said, that's the problem. They don't want to be where you are. Why do you assume that they want to be where you are? So millennials, in the old days, you would position a job as it gives you the corner office, it gives you this package, it gives you this all these benefits. And those were the three things that people sell, right? The package, the benefits, and the promotion. Millennials want passion. They want sense of belonging. They want to know that they can make a difference. And therefore, organizations struggle to hire these people. And therefore, these people end up going to work in entrepreneurial companies. They go to become entrepreneurs. And there's a big advantage of being an entrepreneur, right? Why would you want to work for a large company that doesn't treat you properly when you can go out there, become an entrepreneur, and run your own life? So this first story was about how you manage in COVID times. And the second story is how millennials are really no different to us. So millennials would rather take a risk to create a new business than work for a company that doesn't work the way they want to work, doesn't have goals that they identify with, doesn't give them a learning experience, and doesn't compensate them fairly. Now, that describes a lot of large companies, right? So millennials have this desire, and I am fortunate in that the 3 times that I worked in large companies, they were not like this. So the 3 large companies that I worked in were actually very entrepreneurial. And so millennials by nature are entrepreneurial. And I think this quote by someone I got to know recently, I think says it all. I am a master of my destiny and not a victim of my history. And that's what drives millennials, right? Millennials want to write the future. They want a say in that. And therefore, the millennial actually typifies the entrepreneurial mindset. They want to hone their skills, they want to get the experiences, and they want to control their destiny. And that's, again, extremely entrepreneurial. So the first story is about COVID and how you can be entrepreneurial to help you get through that period. And the second story is about millennials and how they are just entrepreneurial by nature, right? And all their behavior is entrepreneurial. The third story is my story of working in a shipyard. So when I first started, I worked in a shipyard in the UK. And UK shipyards are designed to be very, very rigid, right? So when I worked there were unions, and the union's job was to make sure that they protect the jobs of their tradespeople. So I think you have possibly something similar in different parts of the world. And the union's job is really to make sure everything is structured and everybody gets the correct pay and everybody works the right hours and they're protected, etc., etc., etc. Supposed to work well in real life. Well, it was extremely boring. And after about a year and a bit, I interviewed and got a job in Singapore. And I moved to Singapore and I worked for a shipyard in Singapore, which was very primitive. compared to the shipyard in the UK. But in fact, I was quite surprised. It was basically, a piece of sand next to a river, and we built rigs. Now, the interesting thing about the shipyard is the cost of living in Singapore was going up. The cost of labor in Singapore was going up. And therefore, it wasn't viable for us to stay building the products that we were building. And so we then had to go up the value curve, right? So you had to build more sophisticated stuff. But to build more sophisticated stuff, you had to take a risk. You had to take a risk in buying computer systems. You had to take a risk in buying CNC machines. You had to take a risk in building stuff that you were not used to building. And so we started to build for the Indians, the Russians, the Swedes, countries and communities that we were not used to building. We were primarily a builder of US rigs. And suddenly we started to build for different countries in the world. And engineers like us had to start to learn new ways of doing things. We had to learn new regulations. We had to learn how to design in accordance with different regulatory bodies. And we didn't sit around and say, let's borrow this management philosophy from the US or the UK. No, we said we'll do what makes sense. And what makes sense is that we try our best and we do what entrepreneurs do. Now, entrepreneurs have been the lifeblood of businesses around the world. And therefore, what we decided as a community when we worked is that we would become entrepreneurial. And therefore, we experimented, we took some risk. I remember we bought our first computer, we bought our second computer. I was teaching secretaries how to use word processors. We were teaching draftsmen how to use programmable calculators. And we were going up and building new things as a community. And we helped each other. And we behaved entrepreneurially. And what was the advantage of behaving that way? Well, 33 years after leaving the shipyard in Singapore, it is still in operation. Just 8 years after I left the shipyard in the UK, it closed down. And so you have to understand that if you are going to go forward, if you are going to be successful, what's common is the need to be entrepreneurial. Now, whether it is surviving in COVID times or behaving like millennials, or making sure your organization survives and goes forward, what underlines everything is to be entrepreneurial. And I'm not a fan of a lot of these, management tools which come and go. I mean, we've seen hundreds of tools come over the years. We need to go back to basics and grab what is the most basic and the most powerful concept, and that is to be entrepreneurial. What can you do that is entrepreneurial? And what I always say is that entrepreneurs are not different people. They just do things differently. So whether you work in a large organization or whether you work in a small organization, you have the opportunity to do things differently. And by doing things differently, what I would like to encourage you to do is to do them entrepreneurially. So COVID, millennials, and the shipyard. I behaved like an entrepreneur, although I was not an entrepreneur. And that's something that everybody can do. It is not something that is the domain of a startup. You don't have to be in a startup to behave entrepreneurially. And entrepreneurs, as I have said, just do things differently. Now, they have many reasons for doing this. Primarily, it's because they have to rely on themselves and they can't pass the buck. So there is no one to blame. and that gives them the ability to focus. They are also driven by their passion. But these are not characteristics that you are born with. These are attributes that you can use in your life. These are attributes that you can use in your job. And therefore, I like you to think about how you can be entrepreneurial. Now, this is a cave, and the reason I bring this up is because not so long ago I heard Muhammad Yunus, founder of Grameen Bank, talk about entrepreneurship, and he made a wonderful reference. He said that when we were cavemen living in our caves, we didn't sit down, turn on the light, write a resume, send it to the caveman next door and say, please hire me. So entrepreneurship is actually embedded in us. It's just that it gets knocked out of you as you go through school, as you go through your life. People say, get a job, work for a large company. And Yunus quite rightly says, he said that the more people that work for fewer companies, the more concentrated wealth becomes. And therefore, to create a better world, we need more people working for more companies and not less. The point is that we are all born entrepreneurial. We all take risks. When we decide which car to buy, which house to buy, which university to go to, which school to go to, which job to take, we take risk. We take risk in everything that we do. But yet somehow when we go into the organization, we forget our natural DNA and suddenly we become a corporate executive. We wait for decisions, we cover our ass, and we don't get much done. And what's worse is in large companies, you have what I call custodians of procedure. And these are the guys who tell you why you can't do something. And the result of why they keep telling you that, the end result is you can't do anything. So large organizations have this problem because they are held hostage by what I call custodians of procedure. Now, my book called The 9 Entrepreneurisms really talks about what are these traits. So I'd like to take the next sort of 5 minutes, just run you through them. So the 9 entrepreneurisms, if I was to start with the first 3, self-efficacy, risk-taking, and passion. We all know that, right? You cannot do stuff that you are not good at. And self-efficacy is essentially that. Whether you are an individual or you are a company, you need to build on your self-efficacy. You have to take some risk. But entrepreneurs actually don't take risk because they have the ability to execute, they have the ability to get something done. And that ability doesn't sit with you, and therefore you think that they're taking risk. Organizations can ring fence. Organizations can learn how to take risk. We took risk when we worked in the shipyard. We took risk when I worked in the budget hotel. Passion is another thing that drives entrepreneurs. But passion is not something that you cannot get in an organization. Organizations can also get passion if they are clear about their end objectives. Innovation, opportunism, and learning, right? We talked about that in COVID times. We talked about that when I worked in the shipyard. You have to be innovative, you have to be opportunistic, and we are all opportunistic in our daily lives. It's bound up by learning. And learning means taking something on board and using it. If you don't use it, it's not learning. And the final 3 are realism, persuasion, and execution, right? So you have to be realistic. When I was in the shipyard or when I worked in the budget hotel group, we have to be realistic. What are our core capabilities? What is it that we are missing? What is it that we need to acquire? And how do we persuade people? And then how do we execute? And execution, as we all know, is everything. If you can't execute, you don't have anything, right? And all good decisions require the fact that the decision that you make has the outcome that you want through execution. So these are the 9 entrepreneurisms which I encourage you to adopt either on a personal basis or in your organization. And so I would like to leave you with 2 statements. One is, you don't need to start a business to be an entrepreneur. And 2, if you are an employer, you can hire the best people if you allow your managers to be entrepreneurs. Don't come and tell me that I can't find people. The organizations that I worked for, I'm always able to find people. And I'm able to find people because I'm clear about what my organization is going to do. I'm clear about the role that people are going to undertake, and I'm honest and open with them. If you're honest and open, you can hire good people. And that's it. So 3 stories: COVID, millennials, and the shipyard. And they're all linked by being entrepreneurial. And so what I encourage all of you to do is to be entrepreneurial. Happy to take questions. You might have to interpret them for me. I'm not sure I can hear you very well.
Thank you very much, Anwar. That was a very insightful session, and how you explained the session to us through the stories and how you connected, and there was an underlying message among all the things that you shared. Now, I would like about the first things, and being an employee myself and being with a desire to contribute maximum to the firm or the community that I belong to. So I always constantly look for an instant validation or an instant recognition from my employers if I bring in those entrepreneurial skills into that employer for that company. And many a time the company fails to do so. And I've been quite vocal about it to my management as well. But because you need some motivation or the fuel reciprocation from your employer as well to perform in that. So what are your comments on that? Like, how should employers be so much proactive in terms of awarding or recognizing the new changes that the millennials are bringing to the company?
Yep. So there are essentially 2 ways of doing it, right? So one way is to remove the constraints, right? So some organizations have constraints in that they focus a lot on what you cannot do. And you need to be able to unwind that, right? So there are, sometimes what happens in organizations is the finance and the back end people get too involved. And then they start to impose on operational people. And they start to impose restrictions, right? And that becomes a problem. The second thing is that organizations need to open up and be honest, right? So they need to be able to say, yes, we want you to try new things. And if you try something new and the organization says, no, Yash, you can't do that, then you need to have an honest conversation about what am I here for, right? And a lot of young people are leaving organizations because the organization is not able to answer that question. In the old days, an organization would say, you come and work for me and I'll check in and see how you're doing. Organizations don't behave that way anymore. The organization is asking him, are we doing enough for you? And those are the organizations that are going to win. If organizations don't start to do that, they're going to lose. Innovation is also another issue which can be measured, right? So we all think about innovation in terms of bringing new products or new services. But innovation really is, did they listen to Yash? How long does it take for them to listen to a suggestion? What is the friction internally to a suggestion? And some firms today are releasing indexes which talk about the innovation index. And the innovation index is really how much friction is there between an idea and its trial. So it's a complex issue, but you will get some managers who won't listen. And what I say in my book is then it's time to leave.
That's quite profound insight in terms of how managers or how people who are there should, like, generally the companies have the top down approach rather than a bottom up approach. And I am pretty much vocal about the bottom up approach, and how if the people at the bottom contribute much so that the up level people can scale and grow the companies. Another important thing is a lot of people kind of say it in a, how do you differentiate between a change that has been an organic change because of the things that are moving rapidly around the world, or you differentiate between the change that has been bought by a particular team or by a particular person. Now a lot of people say that, okay, I was the person who kind of got the people into going into the Zoom calls or the Skype calls, but any which ways company would have gone into that. And that becomes difficult for a person to prove that it was an organic change that would meant to happen, or I bought that change.
I mean, the question comes, why does it make a difference?
Yeah.
Right. And so, one of the things that I'm not a fan of is trying to change culture. My thinking has always been, don't bother to change culture. Change the rules, culture will follow. Microsoft is a 40-year-old company. They regularly change their compensation system because they realize by changing the compensation system, they can drive change in behavior. Right? I lived in Singapore for many years while the government tried to stop people from chewing gum and spitting it out or walking on the road or littering. After a while, they said, let's just put a rule in. And the moment you put a rule in, the behavior changed. And we've got that experience now with COVID, right? You don't have to persuade anybody. I mean, if you have to persuade people, look what's happening in Arizona and Florida. Persuasion doesn't work. You just change the rules, people change the behavior. So, two points really. One is it necessary to get recognition for what you do? And if you're honest, or not just you, I'm saying, if we are honest about the impact that we have, much of the impact that we have comes through collaboration. If you were to sit down and say, whose idea was it originally? Sometimes it's hard to get to that, right? Ideas come about because you share, you learn, you reflect, and then you come up with an idea. So I think if it's a question of taking credit for it, then it's a question of why is credit necessary? I think that needs to be asked.
Yeah, that's quite profound in terms of how we kind of think of short-term recognitions or validations of our contribution rather than thinking of a big-term impact of the things that we are kind of doing. Now, I would kind of ask you a very important question, that we all are kind of the CEOs of our own life, the kind of entrepreneurs of our own life, and how the decision, like even if you are a family or a homemaker, you kind of take that decision for yourself, and a lot of people depend in your family about the decision that you take. So what sort of entrepreneurial advice you want to give to the people, so that even if they are not at a position where they can contribute, even in their personal life, they can have those decisions? Because a lot of people think about entrepreneurship, about their professional life, about making an impact, starting that business, but I want to speak about the entrepreneurship in your family life, in your day-to-day life, apart from your work, how your relationships with your kids, how your relationship with your spouse, and how you can use those terms and create an impact there.
I mean, I think one of the important things about at the base of the entrepreneurial spirit is really the need for building skills, right? And building self-efficacy. And I think that you want to encourage that. And unfortunately, my children are all grown up, but if they were young, I wish I'd allowed them to experiment more, to do different things. And I think that entrepreneurs respect the learning experience, and whether it's in a family situation or in a friendship situation, you are going to get ups and downs. And essentially, entrepreneurs need to be able to take that learning experience from it, right? So on the one side, it's build that self-efficacy. The second is to take opportunities as they come along, to be opportunistic, and then to learn from it. So, we are, as Eunice says, we are by nature entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship is our normal being. Our normal being is not to sit and take orders and listen to somebody. We do that as a collective because it's, as a species, when we self-organize, we can achieve more. And therefore, there's a tendency to get into this cluster and self-organize. But by nature, we are entrepreneurial. We want to express ourselves.
That's quite true, and that is what no matter what your designation is, no matter what it is, you can have this entrepreneurship life in your personal life as well. Now, I want to speak about the journey. A lot of corporates starts as entrepreneurs, and as entrepreneurs start those companies, but soon, because the stake becomes too big, there are investors coming in, there are team building up, and there are all those things starts happening in this company, and then they kind of tend to move into that typical corporate dilemma.
Yes.
So what advice you want to give to those entrepreneurs who have been growing, or who are listening to this, or will be listening to this in the future as well? Like, what happens to that spirit? Some of the companies keep on doing it, like Amazon, WhatsApp, but a lot of them fail to do it because of the different stakeholders involved. And you have worked with entrepreneurs, like you have been working with entrepreneurs right now as well. What advice do you give it to them to kind of stick to that mindset, or change whenever required, or whatever?
So the key thing is to have honesty internally in the organization and to have clarity about where you're going. When organizations become larger, you end up having more and more layers. And when you notice an organization has several layers, there's a whole layer of managers whose job is just to manage other people who manage other things. And that's something that you need to be able to avoid, right? So you want to avoid this layer of managers who manage other people. And if you go back 20 years ago, it was possibly necessary because you did not have the tools, you did not have the technology that allowed the seamless flow of information. So there had to be nuclear points where you collect, analyze, and disseminate. Today, you don't need that. Today, information can be organized straight through without the need for intervention. And therefore, a lot of these people who are set and managing these interventions want to hang on to their jobs because they realize that that's all they do. And as I talk to people who are going through this COVID period, and in some organizations, I've said to them that if you find that there isn't very much for you to do today during COVID, you need to worry. Because maybe you're not required. And organizations tend to build a lot of these people because, the boss likes to have people around him, and then he likes the hierarchy, and then people keep saying yes, sir, to him. And then all these layers of management tend to cloud things. The lack of technology means you have to rely on a few people because they are collecting information and sending it down. But the world doesn't need that anymore. The world now wants frontliners to manage situations, right? So I want my hotel managers to have the responsibility that if they need to waive a charge, if they need to do something extra for the guests, they don't need to call HQ. And if they do it, they're not going to get into trouble. They don't need to ask permission. So, you need to constantly think about your organization. Say, do I really need people to watch people? Or can I just build an organization that our clarity is clear, our goals are clear, I don't need all these people to watch people. I don't need all these people to make sure other people don't do things wrong, right? I don't need all these people filling up forms, collecting information. I mean, I have a friend who works for a large organization, and she said that every now and then she stops sending out a report. And if in 2 weeks nobody says, hey, where's that report? She stops it forever. Because that's what a lot of people in organizations do, right? They and why do they do that? They shouldn't do that. This is
I would totally agree with that thing. That's a very, I would start implementing it right away. I make so many reports on a day-to-day basis.
What the hell, right?
Yeah.
And then the reports get bigger and bigger and bigger, and nobody reads it. And then everybody thinks that, you see, then that's the issue, right? In an organization, what happens is everybody thinks that their job is making the report. That's not their job. That's not the job of the organization. The job of the organization is to serve a customer. How does making the report serve a customer? If you can, then it's fine. But if you can't, then your job is not making the report, because making the report doesn't help anybody. And so organizations need to constantly ask themselves, are we doing enough? Are we doing the right thing? Is this serving the consumer? Is this serving the customer? Because if it's just serving internal people, and a lot of large organizations have many, many, many people who serve only internal people, what the hell for? Right? So long answer to short question.
But there was a lot of insight in this question, in this answer specifically, when you mentioned about that if you're not required during the COVID period and the post-COVID period, whether this mind shift will happen into the people, so you have to question yourself continuously, and because the mind shift, like I think it was not only the millennials who got adapted, and the huge change happened in the generations that you belong, right? So. And now if that will be compounded, what I think of in the near future. And if you don't upskill yourself, or if you don't learn the new skills that will be required, then I'm sorry to say, my friends, but the world ahead would be very tough. My last question for you from myself is about, if you want to give 3 advice to a person who is working in a corporate, what would that be?
Be clear about
mid-senior level.
So be clear about the skills that you have, right? So people tend to mix up the job they do with the skills they have. They're different things. The job you do is the job you do. But the skills you have are what is important, right? So because the skills that you have are the skills that give you the mobility, not the job you have, right? So if you're mid-level, you need to think about the skills that you have. The second thing you need to think about is, ask yourself, how are you relevant to the organization? And if you are relevant to the organization because you do something that impacts on the end customer, then you need to be okay. Or rather, you will be okay. But if you are only relevant to the organization because you organize internal things, then you need to worry about what are you going to do. Because a lot of these internal organizing jobs will be streamlined and technology will take over, right? So it's really understand your skills, understand your relevance to the organization, and you should start exploring. Because, you know, the days of I'm going to work for this organization for 20 years or 30 have long been gone. I mean, you know, even in my generation, you can't expect that. So you need to do these 3 things all the time, right? The first one is understand your skills. Be clear about that. Check your relevance, and then explore. And when you explore in 2 dimensions. Explore in what you can do with the skills that you have, and explore what you would like to do, and therefore what skills you need. And I think these are the three things you should do.
True. I think a lot of people around us need to be educated in what things you communicate. And if it comes from somebody like you who has been working, because I kind of feel there is some sort of a barrier that is between the millennials and the generations above us, and the people like you who are contributing into the society by bridging that gap is quite profound. And I think there's a lot of inputs and insights needed in the things that you communicate to the audience. So thank you very much, Anwar, for a wonderful Q&A round with me.